Have you ever wondered if the legends are true? If creatures of myth and horror could walk among us, hidden in the shadows, watching our every move? This story dives deep into the unsettling world of Wendigo sightings, pulling together real encounters that blur the lines between myth and reality. Prepare yourself for a journey that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the wilderness. It started innocently enough, with whispers and rumors shared around campfires and in dimly lit cabins. Tales of a creature that stalked the northern forests, a shadow that moved with a life of its own, creeping along the edges of human settlements. The locals called it Wendigo, a word that carried with it a weight of fear, a name only spoken in hushed tones. Those who claimed to have seen it described a towering figure, gaunt and skeletal, with hollow eyes that glinted in the moonlight. They spoke of its emaciated form, limbs stretched unnaturally long, as though hunger itself had reshaped it. For a long time, I dismissed these stories as nothing more than folklore, eerie tales meant to keep people indoors at night. But then I started collecting accounts, real stories from people who swore they had come face to face with something beyond explanation. These were not tales from the distant past. They were modern, recent encounters, each more unsettling than the last. One story came from a seasoned hunter, a man who had spent most of his life in the wilderness. He described a night when he was deep in the forest, alone but for the quiet rustle of leaves and the occasional call of an owl. As he made his way back to camp, he felt an unnatural silence descend around him. The usual sounds of the forest had ceased, leaving an oppressive stillness that pressed against his skin. And then he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch beyond what was humanly possible. Its eyes caught the faint beam of his light, reflecting back with an eerie glow. He froze, unable to move, as the creature tilted its head, almost as if it were studying him. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, the man recounted how he felt a wave of dread wash over him, a primal fear that told him he was in the presence of something that defied nature itself. The hunter's story stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind like a dark shadow that refused to dissipate. He was a man known for his courage and steadiness, not one to be easily rattled, yet there had been a tremor in his voice as he recounted his experience. He hadn't returned to that part of the forest since. In his own words, he felt like he had trespassed into something sacred, a realm where humans were not meant to tread. The encounter had shaken him to his core, leaving behind a scar that could not be seen, but was deeply felt. Word of the hunter's experience spread quickly among the locals, igniting a mixture of fear and curiosity. Some dismissed it as the overactive imagination of a man too long in the wilderness, but others whispered their own accounts, fragments of experiences that they had kept buried, afraid of being ridiculed. As I listened to their stories, a pattern began to emerge, a strange sense of unity among the accounts, as if each sighting was a piece of a larger, more terrifying puzzle. Another story came from a woman who worked as a park ranger. She was familiar with the sounds and sights of the forest, knew every trail, every clearing, every hidden path. But one evening, as she was doing a routine patrol near the edge of the park, she encountered something that defied all her years of training. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees, and she was about to head back when she noticed a strange figure standing at the tree line. At first she thought it was another hiker, perhaps lost or injured, but as she approached, something felt wrong. The figure was too still, too silent, like a statue carved from the shadows themselves. She called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. As she got closer, she noticed the gauntness of its form, the unnaturally long limbs that hung loosely at its sides, and the hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. A chill ran down her spine, and every instinct screamed at her to turn and run. She backed away slowly, never taking her eyes off the creature, until she was far enough to turn and sprint back to her vehicle. When she reported the incident, her colleagues were skeptical. They laughed it off, attributing it to fatigue or a trick of the fading light. But she knew what she had seen, and the memory haunted her. In the quiet hours of the night, she could still feel those hollow eyes watching her, waiting, as if the creature had followed her home, lingering in the shadows just beyond her sight. As I continued gathering stories, each account seemed to confirm the last, weaving together a tapestry of fear and fascination that defied explanation. It was as if these sightings were pieces of a forbidden knowledge, secrets of the wilderness that only a few had glimpsed. Each person I spoke with had their own story, a unique encounter that left them with an unsettling awareness of something lurking just out of sight. One night, I met a young man named Caleb who had a particularly disturbing experience. He was an avid camper, someone who felt more at home under the stars than in his own bed. He'd been camping in a remote area near the mountains, a place untouched by the usual crowds, where the silence was so deep that it seemed to press against his ears. He set up camp, built a fire, and settled in, enjoying the solitude. As the night grew darker, the forest around him fell into an eerie quiet. The usual sounds, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, faded away, leaving an unnatural silence. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Caleb tried to shake off the feeling, convincing himself that he was just overthinking, but a creeping sense of unease had already taken hold. Then, from the edge of the firelight, he heard it, a faint scratching sound, like claws scraping against bark. His heart raced as he scanned the darkness, but he saw nothing, just trees and shadows, stretching endlessly into the night. The sound came again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate scraping that sent chills down his spine. He shone his flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness, but all he could see were branches swaying in the breeze. Caleb was about to sit back down when something caught his eye, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight, barely visible in the darkness. His breath caught in his throat as he took in the shape. A tall, emaciated figure with unnaturally long limbs, its body twisted and gaunt. It stood there, watching him with hollow, unblinking eyes, its presence a silent threat that made his blood run cold. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the creature tilted its head, studying him with an intensity that felt almost predatory. It took a step forward, and Caleb's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his belongings, leaving the fire burning, and sprinted through the forest, not daring to look back. He could hear the soft crunch of leaves behind him, the faint sound of something moving through the trees, but he didn't stop until he reached his car. Even now, he avoids that part of the forest, unwilling to risk another encounter with whatever it was that he saw. His friends mocked him, saying he'd probably just seen a deer or a trick of the shadows. But Caleb knew better. He knew what he'd seen, and the memory haunted him, a lingering fear that stayed with him long after the night had ended. If this story has left you with chills, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who are drawn to the mysteries hidden in the wilderness. The stories kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. It seemed as if everyone had heard of someone who'd seen something strange in the woods, something that defied reason and left those who encountered it with a sense of dread they couldn't shake. The sightings were spreading, stretching further and deeper into the wilderness, as if whatever force lay behind these encounters was growing bolder. One evening, I met a man named Henry at a small, dimly lit bar on the edge of town. He was a retired forest ranger, a grizzled man with lines etched deep into his weathered face. He'd worked the northern forest for nearly 4 decades, and in all that time, he swore he'd only been truly afraid once. As he recounted his story, his hands trembled slightly, the weight of his memories pressing down on him like a physical burden. It was a winter night, the kind where the air is so cold that it cuts through your clothes like a knife. Henry was on patrol, driving through a remote section of the forest, checking for any signs of trespassers or illegal hunters. The snow had fallen thick that week, covering everything in a blanket of white, making the forest seem even more silent and desolate than usual. His truck's headlights cast a pale glow over the trees, illuminating the snow-covered branches as he drove. He was about halfway through his patrol when he saw something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road, silhouetted against the darkness. At first, he thought it might be a stranded hiker, but as he drew closer, he realized something was terribly wrong. The figure was tall, impossibly so, its body unnaturally thin and elongated. It stood perfectly still, facing him, its eyes catching the headlights in a way that sent a chill down his spine. Henry stopped the truck, the engine idling as he stared at the figure, a sense of unease creeping over him. There was something about it that felt wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body too gaunt, like a shadow stretched beyond its natural form. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching him with hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the light. Summoning his courage, Henry rolled down his window and called out, asking if the figure needed help. But there was no response, only silence, thick and oppressive, pressing down on him like a weight. The figure tilted its head, almost as if it were studying him, and for a moment, Henry felt as though he were the one being hunted. He quickly rolled up the window and locked the doors, his heart pounding as he put the truck in reverse, backing away slowly. As he did, he saw the figure take a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. Henry didn't wait to see what it would do next. He hit the gas, the tires spinning on the icy road as he sped away, not daring to look back. For weeks after that encounter, he was plagued by nightmares, haunted by the image of that towering, gaunt figure standing in the snow, watching him with those hollow eyes. He never spoke of it to anyone, afraid they would think he was crazy. But the memory stayed with him, a shadow that loomed over him long after he'd left the forest. Henry's story added a new layer to the fear surrounding the forest. The way he described that figure, with limbs too long and eyes that seemed to absorb the light, painted a picture of something inhuman, something that didn't belong in the natural order of the world. The more I listened to these stories, the more it felt like the forest itself was hiding secrets, like it was a living, breathing entity that allowed these dark creatures to thrive in its shadows. Another chilling account came from a pair of hikers, siblings who had ventured into the forest for a weekend getaway. They were experienced outdoors enthusiasts, familiar with the trails and well prepared for the challenges of the wilderness. They had chosen a remote path, one that wound through dense woods and up into the mountains, promising stunning views and complete solitude. But they would leave the forest with far more than photographs and memories of scenic vistas. It was late in the afternoon when they set up camp, pitching their tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they gathered around a small fire, talking and laughing, oblivious to the encroaching darkness. It wasn't until the fire began to die down that they noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, the occasional hoot of an owl, had gone completely silent, leaving an unnatural stillness that seemed to press in on them from all sides. They exchanged uneasy glances, each sensing that something was wrong, but unable to put it into words. Then, from the edge of the clearing, they heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone, or something, was striking a branch against a tree. It was a slow, deliberate sound, echoing through the silence in a way that made their skin crawl. The siblings froze, their eyes scanning the darkness, but they couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of the dying embers. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent, as if whatever was making the sound was drawing closer. The brother grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the source of the noise, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment they saw nothing, just trees and shadows. But then, at the very edge of the light, a figure emerged from behind a tree. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, as though it had been pieced together from fragments of different creatures. Its eyes glowed faintly in the light, reflecting back a cold, lifeless stare that sent a shiver down their spines. The creature stood there, motionless, watching them with an intensity that felt almost intelligent, as if it were assessing them, deciding whether they were worth its time. The siblings backed away slowly, their hearts pounding, but the creature didn't move. It remained at the edge of the clearing, its gaze fixed on them, its body casting long, distorted shadows in the flashlight's beam. The brother whispered to his sister, urging her to stay calm, but he could see the terror in her eyes, mirroring his own. Then, without warning, the creature took a step forward, its movements slow and fluid, as though it were gliding rather than walking. The siblings stumbled backward, nearly tripping over their own feet as they scrambled to put distance between themselves and the thing that had emerged from the darkness. The creature paused, tilting its head in a way that seemed almost curious, before letting out a low, guttural sound that echoed through the clearing. That was enough to break their paralysis. They turned and ran, abandoning their campsite, their tent, everything they had brought with them. They didn't stop until they were miles away, their legs burning, their lungs gasping for air. When they finally reached safety, they realized they had left behind all their belongings, tents, food, even their cameras and gear. They had come to the forest seeking adventure, but they left with a fear that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. If this story is drawing you in, leaving you with chills, don't forget to like and share this video to let others experience the mystery and terror of the unknown. The stories of strange encounters and unexplainable sightings continued to pile up, each one adding another layer of dread to the already chilling lore of the forest. It was as though an invisible web of fear had been woven across the wilderness, connecting everyone who had ever come too close to the forest's dark secrets. Every story seemed to hint at something deeper, something ancient and hidden that thrived in the untouched parts of the woods. As I gathered these accounts, I couldn't help but feel drawn to the forest myself, compelled by a strange fascination to see if I could experience what so many others had claimed to witness. I wasn't a skeptic by any means. I had heard too many credible voices, seen too much genuine fear in the eyes of those who had shared their stories. But part of me felt that I needed to go deeper, to uncover whatever truth lay buried within those trees. So one cold, foggy morning, I packed my gear and set off alone, determined to find the place where reality seemed to blur into something darker. The forest was still and silent as I entered, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Every step felt like it took me further from the world I knew, as if I were crossing an invisible threshold into a realm where normal rules no longer applied. As I ventured deeper, a sense of unease settled over me, a feeling that I was being watched. The trees loomed tall and silent around me, their branches twisting overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the weak morning light. Shadows pooled at the base of each tree, dark and unmoving, like patches of ink spilled across the forest floor. I could feel my heart beating faster, each thump echoing in the unnatural silence. Hours passed as I moved further into the forest, the landscape growing more dense and foreboding with each step. I had been following a narrow, barely visible trail that wound through the trees, but at some point, I realized I had lost it. Panic flared briefly in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had a map and a compass, and I could always retrace my steps if needed. But as I glanced at my compass, I felt a jolt of confusion. The needle was spinning slowly, drifting from side to side, as if unsure of which direction to point. I tapped it, shook it, but the needle refused to settle, leaving me disoriented in the midst of a forest that suddenly felt vast and endless. A soft whispering sound reached my ears, so faint that I thought I might be imagining it. I strained to listen, but the sound seemed to fade, slipping away like mist in the wind. I continued forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence, the whispering growing louder as I moved deeper into the trees. It was as if the forest itself was alive, breathing, whispering secrets just beyond my understanding. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I turned to look. At first, I saw nothing, just shadows and trees, an endless expanse of gray and green. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the dim light, half hidden in the shadows. The figure was tall, skeletal, with limbs that seemed too long for its body, twisted and angular like the branches of a dead tree. Its eyes were dark, empty pits, staring at me with a hollow gaze that seemed to pierce through me. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, a bone-deep chill that left me rooted to the spot, unable to move. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, and then it took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each step making no sound. I wanted to run, to turn and flee, but my body refused to respond, as if I were trapped in a nightmare, frozen in place by the weight of my own fear. As the figure drew closer, I could see it more clearly, the gauntness of its face, the way its skin stretched taut over its bones, pale and sickly in the dim light. Its mouth was a thin, straight line, twisted into an expression of hunger that made my stomach turn. The closer it came, the stronger the sense of wrongness became, a feeling that I was in the presence of something that should not exist. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in place by the creature's gaze, but eventually I managed to take a step back, and then another. The figure stopped, its head tilting again, as if puzzled by my movements. I took another step back, and then turned, breaking into a run, as the forest seemed to close in around me. Branches clawed at my arms and face as I ran, the whispering voices growing louder, filling my ears with a cacophony of sounds that I couldn't understand. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see, afraid that the creature was right behind me, reaching out with those twisted skeletal fingers. Finally, I burst out of the dense trees and stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. I looked around, but there was no sign of the creature, no indication that anything had followed me. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then, as I looked down, I noticed something chilling. The ground beneath me was covered in strange symbols, etched into the earth in patterns that made no sense. They spiraled outward from where I stood, twisting and looping in intricate designs that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The sight of those symbols filled me with a dread I couldn't explain, a feeling that I had stumbled into something far older and more dangerous than I could comprehend. I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I turned and ran, leaving the clearing behind, desperate to escape the forest and the horrors that lurked within. The sight of those symbols haunted me long after I left the forest. The memory lingered at the edge of my mind, resurfacing in moments of silence, in the dead of night when sleep refused to come. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just an overactive imagination, that I'd somehow let the forest get the better of me. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen was real. The symbols, the whispers, the figure lurking in the shadows, they were all part of something far beyond my understanding. I found myself drawn back to the accounts I had collected, reading and rereading each story with a new perspective, searching for patterns, connections that might reveal what lay at the heart of the forest's mysteries. I became obsessed, spending hours in libraries, poring over old maps, historical records, anything that might shed light on the dark force that seemed to reside within those trees. One night, as I was digging through an old archive, I stumbled upon a record from the late 1800s, detailing a series of disappearances that had occurred near the very same forest. The report was faded, barely legible, but the description of the missing individuals sent a chill down my spine. They had all vanished under similar circumstances, their last known locations mere miles from the clearing where I had seen the strange symbols. The document mentioned rumors of an ancient curse, a forest spirit that preyed on those who ventured too deep. But there were no concrete explanations, only vague, ominous warnings left behind by those who had dared to investigate. Driven by a need for closure, I decided to return to the forest one final time. I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease, to prove that I wasn't haunted, that there was a logical explanation for everything I had seen. Armed with a camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, I set off in the early morning, the mist still clinging to the ground as I made my way through the familiar trails. As I ventured deeper, the oppressive silence returned, wrapping around me like a shroud. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the stillness, each sound sending a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. My heart raced as I approached the clearing where I had seen the symbols, my pulse pounding in my ears like a war drum. When I reached the clearing, I froze. The symbols were gone. The ground was smooth, undisturbed, as if no one had ever set foot there. I scanned the area, desperately searching for some sign, some proof of what I had seen. But there was nothing, only empty earth and the faint sound of the wind whispering through the trees. Frustration and confusion washed over me. Had I imagined it all? Had the forest somehow erased the evidence, covering its tracks as if to mock me? As I stood there, questioning my own sanity, I felt a chill run down my spine, a sensation I had come to know all too well. Slowly, I turned, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon me. And there, at the edge of the clearing, was the figure. It stood motionless, its hollow eyes fixed on me with a gaze that seemed to pierce through to my very soul. Its body was as gaunt and twisted as I remembered, its limbs unnaturally long and skeletal, casting dark, distorted shadows in the faint light. I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if the forest itself were closing in, trapping me within its grasp. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear my gaze away from those empty eyes. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement that conveyed a sense of understanding, as if it knew exactly why I had returned, as if it had been waiting for me all along. A sense of dread settled over me, heavier than before, and in that moment I understood. This was no ordinary creature. This was a part of the forest itself, a manifestation of something ancient and malevolent, a force that had existed long before any human had set foot in these woods. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the silence as I fled from the clearing. I didn't stop, didn't look back, my only thought to escape the oppressive darkness that seemed to close in around me. The whispers grew louder as I ran, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices, each one more insistent than the last, urging me to turn back, to surrender to the shadows. I stumbled through the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body aching from the strain. The forest seemed to twist and warp around me, the trees closing in like the bars of a cage, trapping me within its depths. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified to a deafening roar, until I could no longer tell where I was, or even if I was still moving at all. Finally, I burst through the edge of the forest, collapsing onto the ground as the sunlight washed over me. The whispers faded, the shadows retreating as I lay there, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from the experience. I looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me with those hollow eyes. But there was nothing, only trees and silence, the forest appearing as innocent and serene as ever. In the days that followed, I tried to piece together what I had seen, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. The memory haunted me, a lingering fear that refused to fade, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edges of the known world. I had gone seeking answers, but I had returned with only more questions and a sense of dread that would stay with me for the rest of my life. After I escaped the forest, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever darkness resided there would be content to let me go. But the forest, it seemed, wasn't finished with me. In the days that followed, I felt its lingering presence in every shadow, every corner of my vision, where the light didn't quite reach. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows that disappeared the moment I turned to look. The feeling of being watched, of something waiting just beyond sight, gnawed at me, an ever-present reminder of what I had encountered. Night brought no relief. My dreams were plagued by visions of that skeletal figure, its hollow eyes and twisted limbs haunting me in the darkness. I would wake in a cold sweat, heart racing. The image of its face burned into my mind, and always there was the sense of those whispers, faint but insistent, echoing in my mind even after I was awake. They called to me, pulling me back to the forest, a dark invitation I couldn't ignore. I became obsessed with finding answers, unable to accept that I would never understand what I had experienced. I pored over the stories of others who had encountered similar phenomena, trying to piece together a pattern, a clue that might explain the mystery of the forest. I found tales of ancient spirits, of dark entities that lurked in the depths of the wilderness, feeding on the fear of those who dared to venture too close. But none of it brought me any closer to understanding. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, sifting through the pages of old folklore, I felt a sudden chill in the room. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive silence that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. My heart pounded as I looked around, the shadows seeming to deepen, stretching across the walls like dark fingers reaching out to me. And then I saw it, the figure, standing in the corner of the room, watching me with those same hollow eyes. It was as if the forest had followed me, bringing its darkness into my home, its presence a stark reminder that I could never truly escape. I froze, paralyzed by fear, unable to look away from its gaze. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its malice, a cold, consuming hunger that seemed to reach out, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. In that moment, I knew that the forest had claimed me, that I was marked by something far beyond my understanding. No matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I could feel it, a dark thread woven into my very being, binding me to the forest and the horrors that lay within. As suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me alone in the silence. But the feeling of its presence lingered, a shadow that clung to me like a second skin. I knew then that I would never be free, that the darkness I had encountered in the forest had become a part of me, a constant reminder of the thin line between our world and whatever lay beyond. In the weeks that followed, I withdrew from my friends, from my family, unable to explain the fear that consumed me. They noticed the change, the way my eyes darted to every shadow, the way I flinched at the slightest sound. But how could I tell them? How could I make them understand the terror that lurked in every dark corner, the whispers that haunted my every waking moment? Eventually, I stopped sleeping, afraid of the dreams that awaited me, afraid of the darkness that would come to claim me the moment I closed my eyes. My days blurred together, a haze of exhaustion and paranoia that left me on the edge of sanity. I would sit by the window, staring out at the trees in the distance, watching as the shadows crept closer with each passing night. One night, in a moment of desperation, I returned to the forest. I told myself it was to find closure, to put an end to the fear that had taken over my life. But deep down, I knew it was something more, a compulsion, a dark pull that I could no longer resist. The forest had become a part of me, and I had no choice but to answer its call. As I entered the forest once again, the familiar silence enveloped me, the weight of the darkness pressing down like a heavy blanket. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches twisting overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. I followed the path I had taken before, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually I found myself standing in the clearing where I had first seen the symbols. The ground was bare, undisturbed, as if my previous visit had never happened. But as I looked closer, I saw something glinting in the moonlight, a single, dark stone, polished and smooth, lying at the center of the clearing. I picked it up, feeling its cold weight in my hand, a strange sense of familiarity washing over me, and then, as I held it, the whispers returned, louder this time, filling my mind with a dark symphony of voices. They spoke of secrets, of a world hidden beneath the surface of our own, a place where shadows held life and darkness reigned. I understood then that I had been chosen, not by chance but by the forest itself. The darkness had claimed me, drawn me into its embrace, and I was now a part of it, bound to the shadows for as long as I lived. If this final journey into the unknown left you unsettled, don't forget to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and ring the bell for more tales that explore the boundaries between light and darkness.